70 years ago, in the winter of 1939, 9 orphaned children disappeared from St. Mercy Abbey in rural Pennsylvania, vanishing without a trace on the eve of America's entry into World War II. The children, aged between 8 and 14, were last seen during evening prayers before retreating to their dormitories for the night. By morning, their beds lay empty, their few possessions untouched, and the heavy wooden doors of the Abbey remained locked from the inside. The disappearance plunged the small community of Millbrook into unprecedented chaos and despair. Sister Catherine, who had dedicated her life to caring for these forgotten souls, suffered a complete mental breakdown and was institutionalized within weeks. The local sheriff, overwhelmed by a case with no witnesses, no evidence, and no logical explanation, quietly closed the investigation after 6 months of fruitless searching. Families from neighboring towns, already struggling with the looming war, whispered theories but offered no answers. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. The Catholic Church, facing mounting pressure and scandal, made the decision that would haunt the case for decades. They sealed the Abbey permanently and relocated the remaining staff to distant parishes. What should have been a thorough investigation became a bureaucratic burial. The children's names were quietly removed from official records, their existence scrubbed from history as if they had never lived at all. But the families of these lost souls never forgot. Margaret O'Brien, whose younger brother Timothy was among the missing, spent her entire adult life writing letters to authorities, pleading for the case to be reopened. Eleanor Santos, Timothy's childhood friend who had aged out of the orphanage just months before the disappearance, dedicated her later years to preserving the children's memory through a small memorial garden she maintained behind her home. The official silence was deafening, but the unofficial whispers never stopped. Local residents spoke of strange lights in the abandoned Abbey windows during winter storms, of children's voices carried on the wind through the empty corridors. The building became a monument to unanswered questions, standing like a Gothic tombstone against the Pennsylvania sky. For 7 decades, St. Mercy Abbey kept its secrets locked away in stone and shadow, while 9 families lived with the unbearable weight of not knowing whether their children had run away, been taken, or met some darker fate within those consecrated walls. The 9 children who vanished that December night were more than just names in a forgotten file. They were young lives shaped by tragedy, bound together by circumstance, and united in their desperate hope for a better tomorrow. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. Timothy O'Brien, just 10 years old, had arrived at St. Mercy after his parents died in a factory fire. His sister Margaret, who was too young to care for him, would later describe Timothy as a boy who collected bottle caps and dreamed of becoming a train conductor. Mary Elizabeth Chen, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who died in the influenza outbreak of 1936, was known for her exceptional skill at needlework and her habit of humming lullabies her mother had taught her. The Kowalski twins, Anna and Peter, age 11, had been abandoned at the Abbey's doorstep during the Great Depression, with nothing but a note reading, "Please give them what we cannot." Anna was fiercely protective of her brother, who had been born with a withered left arm. The other children often saw them walking the Abbey grounds hand in hand, Anna describing the world outside the walls that Peter struggled to see through his thick, cracked spectacles. James Patterson, 14 and the oldest of the group, had become an unofficial leader among the orphans. Having lived at St. Mercy longer than anyone, he knew every hidden passage and forgotten corner of the ancient building. Witnesses later recalled seeing him in deep conversation with Father Thomas Whitmore in the days before the disappearance, conversations that ended abruptly whenever other staff members approached. Sarah Williams, 12, had been brought to the Abbey after her mother was institutionalized for what doctors then called female hysteria. Sarah kept a diary filled with pressed flowers and sketches of birds, always talking about the spring day when her mother would come to take her home. That day never came. Robert Bobby Martinez, only 8 years old, was the youngest of the group. His father had died in a mining accident, and his mother, unable to support her children alone, had placed Bobby at St. Mercy with promises to return once she found steady work. Bobby spent every Sunday afternoon by the front gate, watching the road for a familiar figure that never appeared. Finally, there were Rachel and David Goldman, siblings aged 9 and 13, whose Jewish parents had fled Europe in 1935, only to die in a tenement fire 2 years later. The Catholic Church had taken them in despite the religious differences, a decision that would later fuel wild conspiracy theories about their disappearance being connected to rising anti-Semitic sentiment in the region. These weren't faceless statistics in a police report. They were children who laughed together during recreation time, shared their meager portions at dinner, and comforted each other through nightmares. The staff at St. Mercy described them as unusually close-knit, protective of one another, in ways that went beyond typical childhood friendships. They had created their own family within the cold stone walls of the Abbey. Sister Catherine, in her final coherent interview before her mental collapse, described December 15, 1939, as an ordinary day that turned extraordinary only in hindsight. The children attended morning prayers, completed their lessons, and helped with evening chores just as they had hundreds of times before. There were no arguments, no unusual behavior, no signs that 9 young lives were about to vanish into history's darkest corners. When Sheriff William Morrison arrived at St. Mercy Abbey on the morning of December 16, 1939, he expected to find a simple case of children playing an elaborate prank. What he discovered instead was a mystery that would define and ultimately destroy his career in law enforcement. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. The scene that greeted Morrison defied logical explanation. All exterior doors remained locked from the inside, with heavy iron bars still secured across the main entrance. The children's dormitory showed no signs of struggle. Beds were neatly made, personal belongings remained untouched, and the single window was not only locked, but painted shut years earlier. Most disturbing of all, a fresh layer of snow had fallen during the night, yet there were no footprints leading away from the building. Father Thomas Whitmore, the Abbey's administrator, provided Morrison with a timeline that raised more questions than answers. Evening prayers had concluded at 7 p.m., followed by a modest dinner and supervised study time. By 9 p.m., all children were accounted for in their dormitory, with Sister Catherine conducting her nightly head count. The building was then secured according to standard protocol, with Father Whitmore himself checking all locks and exits. Morrison's initial investigation focused on the possibility of outside involvement. He questioned every resident of Millbrook, examined the Abbey's visitor records, and even brought in bloodhounds from the state police. The dogs circled the building frantically, but could find no scent trail leading beyond the Abbey grounds. Local volunteers organized search parties that combed the surrounding forests for weeks, finding nothing but winter silence. The sheriff's growing frustration was evident in his reports, which became increasingly brief and pessimistic as weeks turned to months. Morrison had built his reputation on solving cases through methodical police work, but St. Mercy Abbey presented him with an impossible puzzle. How do 9 children simply vanish from a locked building without leaving any trace of their exit? The Catholic Church's response to Morrison's investigation was politely obstructive. Church officials claimed full cooperation while simultaneously restricting access to certain areas of the Abbey and limiting interview time with staff members. When Morrison requested to examine the Abbey's historical records and architectural plans, he was told that such documents had been misplaced during recent administrative reorganization. Father Whitmore himself became an increasingly problematic witness. His initial statements were consistent and detailed, but as the investigation progressed, the priest began displaying signs of severe emotional distress. He was frequently found wandering the Abbey corridors at night, muttering prayers in Latin and claiming to hear children's voices calling from empty rooms. By March of 1940, church authorities had transferred him to a monastery in California, citing the need for spiritual recovery and prayer. The case officially went cold in June 1940, though Morrison continued pursuing leads on his own time for several more years. His personal files, discovered after his death in 1967, revealed a man haunted by his failure. Page after page of handwritten notes detailed increasingly desperate theories, underground tunnels, conspiracy involving church officials, even the possibility of mass hallucination affecting the entire community. Morrison's final entry, dated December 15, 1945, exactly 6 years after the disappearance, consisted of a single sentence. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved by mortal men. The investigation's failure had far-reaching consequences beyond Morrison's personal anguish. Public trust in local law enforcement eroded, and families throughout Pennsylvania began questioning the safety of institutional care for their children. The case became a cautionary tale whispered among social workers and orphanage administrators. Sometimes children simply vanish, and sometimes there are no answers. But perhaps most tragically, the investigation's collapse meant that 9 young lives were essentially erased from official memory. Without resolution, without closure, without even the dignity of being remembered as victims of crime, the children of St. Mercy Abbey became ghosts long before anyone was willing to admit they might actually be dead. The years following the failed investigation brought a suffocating blanket of institutional amnesia over the St. Mercy Abbey case. What had once been front-page news in the Millbrook Herald gradually faded to occasional anniversary pieces, then to nothing at all. By 1950, mentioning the missing children in polite company was considered poor taste, a reminder of collective failure that the community preferred to forget. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. The Catholic Church's response was swift and thorough. St. Mercy Abbey was officially decommissioned in 1941, its remaining staff scattered to parishes across the country, with strict instructions never to discuss the events of December 1939. The building itself was sealed, its windows boarded, its grounds left to be reclaimed by Pennsylvania wilderness. Church records from that period, when they mention the Abbey at all, refer only to administrative closure due to wartime resource constraints. For Margaret O'Brien, Timothy's sister, the silence was unbearable. She spent the 1940s writing letters to newspapers, politicians, and church officials, each plea for renewed investigation met with polite deflection or outright dismissal. Her correspondence, preserved in the Millbrook Historical Society, reveals a woman consumed by grief and fury. "They want us to forget," she wrote to her congressman in 1952, "as if 9 children never lived, never laughed, never mattered at all." Eleanor Santos, who had aged out of St. Mercy just months before the disappearance, took a different approach to preserving memory. Unable to force official action, she became the unofficial keeper of the children's legacy. Every December 15th, for 40 years, she placed flowers at the sealed gates of the Abbey and spoke each child's name aloud to the winter wind. Local teenagers, daring each other to approach the haunted building, often reported seeing an elderly woman kneeling in the snow, her lips moving in silent prayer. The physical evidence of the investigation gradually disappeared as well. Sheriff Morrison's files were supposedly lost in a courthouse fire in 1955, though several residents later claimed the blaze looked suspiciously intentional. Photographs of the children, once displayed in the Abbey's main hall, vanished along with most other documentation of their existence. Even their graves, 9 small headstones erected in 1945, when the church finally declared them legally dead, were relocated to make room for a new parish center, their exact locations subsequently forgotten by cemetery administrators. But silence, as any investigator knows, often speaks louder than words. The very intensity of the collective amnesia surrounding St. Mercy Abbey suggested something more sinister than simple bureaucratic incompetence. Too many records had been lost, too many witnesses had been transferred, too many questions had been buried for this to be mere coincidence. Local folklore filled the vacuum left by official silence. The Abbey became a focal point for ghost stories and urban legends, with each generation of Millbrook teenagers adding new details to the growing mythology. Some claimed to see children's faces in the boarded windows during thunderstorms. Others reported hearing laughter echoing from the abandoned playground on quiet summer evenings. A few brave souls who managed to break into the building described finding rooms that looked as if they had been frozen in time, with children's belongings scattered across desks and beds made with military precision. The few surviving staff members from St. Mercy lived out their later years in what can only be described as haunted isolation. Sister Catherine, after her release from the psychiatric hospital in 1955, never spoke about the Abbey again, even to her own family. She died in 1978, clutching a rosary and reportedly whispering "forgive me" with her final breath. Father Whitmore, according to records from his California monastery, spent his remaining years in a state of persistent religious mania, claiming that he was being pursued by demons wearing children's faces. By the 1980s, the case had achieved a peculiar kind of immortality, simultaneously famous and forgotten, widely known but never discussed. True crime enthusiasts occasionally stumbled across references to the St. Mercy disappearances, but their attempts to research the case invariably hit dead ends. It was as if the children had vanished twice, once from their beds in 1939, and again from historical memory in the decades that followed. The silence might have continued forever, were it not for one man's determination to restore a crumbling piece of Pennsylvania's religious heritage and his unwitting discovery of a secret that had been sealed away for 70 years. Father Michael Brennan was not supposed to find anything when he arrived at St. Mercy Abbey in the autumn of 2009. The 45-year-old Irish priest had been assigned the mundane task of assessing the abandoned building for potential restoration, a routine evaluation that the Diocese of Philadelphia had been postponing for decades. What he discovered instead would resurrect one of Pennsylvania's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. Brennan approached his assignment with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to uncovering truth in forgotten places. Born in County Cork and educated at Trinity College, Dublin, he had spent 15 years working with historical preservation societies throughout Ireland before accepting his American posting. His specialty was breathing life back into abandoned religious sites, and St. Mercy Abbey represented exactly the kind of challenge he relished. The building he encountered that October morning was a Gothic monument to decay. 70 years of neglect had reduced the once majestic abbey to a crumbling shell, its limestone walls stained with decades of rain and its slate roof partially collapsed. Wild ivy had claimed the exterior walls, and small trees grew from cracks in the foundation. Yet beneath the deterioration, Brennan could see the bones of architectural magnificence, soaring arches, intricate stonework, and stained glass windows that still caught morning light in brilliant fragments. What struck Brennan immediately was the building's unusual layout. His architectural training had taught him to read structures like documents, and St. Mercy Abbey told a story that didn't make sense. Rooms that should have connected were separated by thick walls. Corridors ended abruptly without apparent purpose. Most puzzling of all, his measurements suggested that the building's interior was significantly smaller than its exterior dimensions would indicate. Brennan spent weeks mapping the Abbey's layout, comparing his surveys with architectural plans he'd managed to locate in the diocesan archives. The discrepancies were impossible to ignore. According to the original 1887 blueprints, St. Mercy Abbey should have contained a meditation chamber on the building's east side, accessible through the main chapel. Yet Brennan could find no evidence of such a room. Where the chamber should have been, he encountered only blank stone wall. His curiosity piqued, Brennan began researching the Abbey's history more thoroughly. What he found in dusty church records and newspaper archives shook him to his core. The disappearance of 9 children in 1939 was not the minor incident he'd been led to believe, but a case that had traumatized an entire community and destroyed multiple lives. More disturbing still was the pattern of deliberate concealment he discovered, missing files, transferred witnesses, and a level of institutional silence that suggested active cover-up rather than passive neglect. Brennan's investigation took on an urgency that surprised even him. Working alone in the abandoned abbey, often by flashlight when the building's electrical system failed, he began to understand why the case had haunted so many people for so long. There was something fundamentally wrong about St. Mercy Abbey, something that went beyond architectural anomalies and missing records. The breakthrough came on a bitter December morning, exactly 70 years after the children's disappearance. Brennan was conducting a final structural assessment of the chapel when he noticed something that had previously escaped his attention. The morning sun, streaming through a partially boarded window, cast shadows across the east wall that revealed subtle variations in the stonework. What he had assumed was solid limestone showed signs of being constructed in 2 distinct phases. Using a small hammer and chisel from his toolkit, Brennan began carefully probing the newer section of wall. Within hours, he had confirmed his suspicions. The stone facade was nothing more than a thin veneer covering something beneath. By afternoon, he had created a small opening large enough to peer through with a flashlight. What Father Michael Brennan saw in that beam of light would haunt him for the rest of his life, and finally provide answers to questions that 9 families had been asking for 7 decades. If this case has already captured your attention, leave a like. It helps the channel bring more stories like this and helps the story of the St. Mercy children reach more people. The beam of Father Brennan's flashlight cut through 70 years of darkness to reveal a sight that defied comprehension. Beyond the false wall lay a perfectly preserved room, frozen in time, like an archaeological tomb. Dust motes danced in the light as Brennan's trembling hand played the beam across wooden desks arranged in neat rows, their surfaces still bearing the detritus of interrupted childhood, pencil stubs, paper scraps, and small personal belongings that suggested lives stopped mid-sentence. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. Brennan's first instinct was to contact the authorities immediately, but as he stood in that chapel, staring through his makeshift window into the impossible room, something held him back. Perhaps it was his historian's instinct to document everything before outside forces could interfere, or perhaps it was a deeper understanding that whatever lay beyond that wall had been deliberately hidden for decades. Either way, Father Brennan made a decision that would change everything. He would enter the room alone. Working through the night with tools borrowed from a local hardware store, Brennan carefully expanded the opening in the wall. His archaeological training proved invaluable as he documented each step with photographs and detailed notes, treating the sealed chamber like the crime scene it might very well have been. By dawn, he had created an entrance large enough to squeeze through while disturbing as little as possible. The room beyond was a classroom, but not like any Brennan had ever seen. 9 small desks were arranged in 3 precise rows, each bearing a slate board and wooden chair sized for children. The desks' surfaces were covered with the remnants of that final day, arithmetic problems half solved, drawings of birds and flowers, even what appeared to be Christmas wish lists written in careful childhood script. Most disturbing of all were the walls. Every available surface had been covered with desperate messages scratched into the limestone with fingernails, pencils, and pieces of broken slate. "Help us" appeared dozens of times in various childish hands. Names were carved deep into the stone: Timothy O'Brien, Mary Elizabeth Chen, Anna and Peter Kowalski. Some messages were practical pleas. "We need water and the door won't open." Others revealed the psychological deterioration of children facing an unimaginable situation. "God has forgotten us, and nobody is coming." Brennan spent hours in that chamber, photographing every surface, every message, every heartbreaking artifact. The children's belongings told a story of systematic imprisonment rather than sudden disappearance. Items were arranged as if the children had been living in the room for an extended period. Makeshift beds created from pulled-up floorboards and torn clothing, a small pile of apple cores suggesting someone had been bringing them food, and a corner that had clearly been used as a makeshift latrine. The most chilling discovery came when Brennan examined the room's single door, a heavy oak barrier that opened inward to the classroom. Iron brackets had been installed on the outside, clearly designed to hold a bar that would prevent the door from being opened from within. Scratch marks around the doorframe and worn areas on the wooden surface indicated that the children had spent considerable time trying to claw their way to freedom, but it was the final wall that broke Father Brennan's composure entirely. Carved in letters 6 inches high, obviously the work of multiple hands over many days, was a message that revealed the true horror of what had happened in that sealed room. "Father Whitmore locked us in. Tell Mama we tried to be good." The implications hit Brennan like a physical blow. This wasn't a mystery about vanishing children. It was evidence of mass murder by someone the children had trusted. Father Thomas Whitmore, the priest who had displayed such emotional distress during the original investigation, hadn't been tormented by guilt over his failure to protect the children. He had been consumed by the knowledge of what he had done to them. Brennan's hands shook as he photographed that final damning message. 70 years after their deaths, 9 children were finally able to tell their story. They hadn't vanished into thin air or been spirited away by mysterious forces. They had been deliberately imprisoned in a sealed room by the very person charged with their care, left to die of thirst and starvation while their desperate calls for help echoed unheard through stone walls. As Father Brennan finally emerged from that chamber of horrors, he carried with him not just evidence of an unspeakable crime, but the weight of understanding that institutional silence can be as deadly as any weapon. The Catholic Church hadn't just failed to solve the mystery of the missing children, They had actively participated in covering up their murder. The long-delayed reckoning was about to begin. Father Brennan's hands trembled as he dialed the Pennsylvania State Police from his cell phone in the Abbey's courtyard. After 70 years of silence, 9 murdered children were finally going to have their voices heard. But even as he waited for investigators to arrive, Brennan understood that the evidence in that sealed room would unleash consequences far beyond a simple criminal investigation. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. Detective Sarah Martinez of the Pennsylvania State Police arrived at St. Mercy Abbey expecting to investigate what her dispatcher had described as possible historical remains. What she found instead was a crime scene that challenged every assumption about institutional trust and the passage of time. Martinez, a 15-year veteran with extensive experience in cold cases, would later describe the sealed classroom as the most disturbing scene she had ever encountered. The initial forensic examination confirmed Brennan's worst fears. The scratches on the walls were consistent with fingernails worn down to the quick. Chemical analysis of stains on the floor revealed traces of urine and feces, indicating the children had been imprisoned for days or possibly weeks. Most conclusively, fragments of bone and teeth were discovered in the room's far corner, where the smallest children would have been when death finally claimed them. Carbon dating and forensic anthropology confirmed that the remains belonged to children who died in the winter of 1939-1940. DNA analysis, cross-referenced with samples voluntarily provided by surviving relatives, would eventually identify all 9 victims: Timothy O'Brien, Mary Elizabeth Chen, Anna and Peter Kowalski, James Patterson, Sarah Williams, Bobby Martinez, and Rachel and David Goldman. But the physical evidence, horrifying as it was, paled in comparison to the institutional cover-up that began to unravel in the days following the discovery. Church records suddenly found after decades of being misplaced revealed a pattern of knowledge and deliberate concealment that reached the highest levels of the diocesan hierarchy. Bishop Patrick O'Sullivan's private correspondence, discovered in sealed archives, showed that church officials had known the truth about Father Whitmore's involvement within weeks of the children's disappearance. A letter dated February 1940 explicitly stated that Whitmore had suffered a complete mental breakdown and confessed to an unthinkable act against the innocent souls in his care. Rather than reporting this confession to civil authorities, the church had arranged Whitmore's immediate transfer to California and instructed all involved parties to maintain absolute discretion for the protection of Holy Mother Church. The cover-up had been methodical and ruthless. Sheriff Morrison's investigation had been deliberately sabotaged through the withholding of crucial information. Witnesses had been transferred or silenced. Physical evidence had been destroyed or hidden. Most damning of all, the church had sealed the children's tomb, while their families still held hope for their safe return. Father Whitmore himself had died in 1963 at the California monastery, taking his full confession to the grave. But medical records from his final years, subpoenaed during the investigation, revealed a man consumed by religious mania and persistent hallucinations of children's voices. His final confession to the monastery's abbot, recorded just days before his death, contained a rambling admission of having delivered the innocents to God's judgment to prevent them from corruption by the devil's war. The revelation of Whitmore's motive proved as disturbing as the crime itself. Personal letters and journal entries, discovered in the monastery archives, revealed a priest whose religious extremism had gradually evolved into dangerous psychosis. Whitmore had become convinced that the approaching world war represented the biblical apocalypse, and that the orphaned children in his care were better served by dying in a state of grace than living through the coming tribulation. For the families who had waited 70 years for answers, the truth brought both relief and renewed anguish. Margaret O'Brien, Timothy's sister, was 89 years old when she finally learned her brother's fate. "I always knew he didn't run away," she told reporters from her nursing home bed. "Timothy was afraid of the dark. He would never have left me willingly." Eleanor Santos, who had maintained her memorial garden for 4 decades, survived just long enough to see the children's names restored to dignity. She died peacefully in her sleep 3 weeks after the discovery, having finally fulfilled her promise to keep their memory alive. The Catholic Church's response was swift but insufficient. Official apologies were issued, financial settlements were offered to surviving relatives, and promises of reform were made. But for many, these gestures felt hollow in the face of 7 decades of deliberate deception. The broader implications of the St. Mercy Abbey case extended far beyond one man's crimes or one institution's failures. It became a symbol of how easily truth can be buried when powerful organizations prioritize reputation over justice, and how the most vulnerable members of society, orphaned children, the poor, the forgotten, can disappear without anyone in authority caring enough to ask the right questions. The discovery of the sealed room at St. Mercy Abbey sent shockwaves through Pennsylvania's Catholic community and beyond. What had begun as a routine building assessment had uncovered one of the most shocking cases of institutional cover-up in American religious history. As news of the 9 children's fate spread across national media, the case became a catalyst for broader conversations about accountability, institutional power, and the vulnerability of those society fails to protect. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office launched an immediate investigation into the Catholic Church's role in concealing the murders. Led by prosecutor Amanda Chen, a distant relative of victim Mary Elizabeth Chen, the investigation revealed a systematic pattern of evidence destruction and witness intimidation that continued for decades after the children's deaths. Internal church documents showed that at least 7 bishops and dozens of priests had possessed knowledge of Whitmore's confession, yet all had maintained their silence, even as grieving families begged for information about their missing children. The legal ramifications proved complex due to the passage of time. While Father Whitmore could no longer be prosecuted, several church officials who had participated in the cover-up were still alive. Cardinal Francis Sullivan, who had served as a young diocesan secretary in 1940 and had personally filed Whitmore's confession in sealed archives, faced federal charges for obstruction of justice. At age 94, Sullivan became the highest-ranking Catholic official ever prosecuted in connection with institutional cover-up. The forensic examination of the sealed room continued for months, each new discovery adding layers to the horror. Experts determined that the children had survived for approximately 2 weeks after being imprisoned, sustained by minimal food and water that someone, presumably Whitmore, had provided through a small slot in the door. The psychological torture of slowly starving while crying for help that never came was almost too terrible to contemplate. Personal effects found in the room told heartbreaking stories of children trying to maintain hope even as death approached. Timothy O'Brien had carved a calendar into the wall, marking each day of their imprisonment with pathetic optimism. Mary Elizabeth Chen had braided grass from their meager meals into small friendship bracelets, leaving one for each of her fellow prisoners. The Kowalski twins had died holding hands, their bodies found in the corner they had claimed as their own. Most devastating was a letter discovered scratched into the wooden floor beneath James Patterson's body. The 14-year-old, who had served as the children's unofficial leader, had used his final strength to record their story. "We did nothing wrong. Father Whitmore said we were going to special prayers, but he locked us in. We called and called, but nobody came. Tell our families we love them. Tell them we were good children." The media attention brought forward other survivors from institutions across the country, revealing that the St. Mercy Abbey case was not an isolated incident. A pattern emerged of religious officials using positions of trust to harm vulnerable children, followed by institutional cover-ups that prioritized organizational reputation over victim welfare. The case became a rallying point for survivors' rights groups and advocates for institutional transparency. Margaret O'Brien, despite her advanced age, became an unexpected spokesperson for justice. Her testimony before a congressional committee investigating religious institutional abuse was broadcast nationwide. "They didn't just murder 9 children," she said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. "They murdered the truth. They murdered our right to know. They murdered our ability to mourn properly and say goodbye." The Catholic Church's response evolved from denial to damage control to grudging acknowledgement. Pope Francis issued a personal statement expressing profound sorrow for the innocents who suffered at St. Mercy Abbey and the additional suffering inflicted by those who chose silence over truth. A $50 million settlement fund was established for surviving relatives, Though many rejected the money as inadequate compensation for decades of lies, changes in church policy followed, including mandatory reporting requirements for all allegations of abuse or suspicious deaths, the establishment of independent oversight boards, and the opening of previously sealed archives. Critics argued these reforms came 70 years too late and questioned whether any institutional changes could prevent future cover-ups. The broader cultural impact of the St. Mercy Abbey case extended into discussions about child welfare, institutional accountability, and the dangers of unchecked authority. Social workers reported increased scrutiny of religious institutions, while historians began re-examining other cases of missing children that might have been similarly concealed. For the residents of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, the revelation brought a mixture of vindication and renewed trauma. Those who had whispered about strange occurrences at the abandoned abbey felt validated, while others grappled with the realization that their community had unknowingly harbored evidence of mass murder for 7 decades. The sealed room itself became both evidence and memorial. Plans to demolish St. Mercy Abbey were abandoned in favor of creating a memorial garden where the building once stood. 9 trees were planted in a circle, each bearing a plaque with a child's name and the simple inscription, "Finally remembered, finally at peace." But even as justice slowly unfolded, questions remained about how many other sealed rooms might exist in forgotten corners of institutional America, and how many other voices have been silenced by those who value reputation over truth. 5 years have passed since Father Michael Brennan broke through that false wall and gave voice to 9 children who had been silenced for 7 decades. The St. Mercy Abbey case closed officially in 2014 with the conviction of 3 church officials for obstruction of justice and the establishment of new federal laws requiring transparency in institutional child welfare cases. But the true resolution of this story lies not in legal proceedings or policy changes, but in the enduring power of memory to triumph over institutional silence. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. The St. Mercy Memorial Garden, built on the site where the Abbey once stood, has become an unexpected pilgrimage destination. Families from across the country bring their children to stand beneath the 9 memorial trees and learn about the importance of speaking truth to power. The garden's central monument bears the words that James Patterson scratched into the classroom floor during his final hours, "Tell them we were good children." Margaret O'Brien died peacefully in 2013, just months after seeing the memorial dedicated. Her final interview, recorded for the Millbrook Historical Society Oral History Project, captured both the pain and the profound relief of finally knowing the truth. "I spent 80 years wondering if Timothy ran away because he didn't love me enough to stay. Now I know he died because he loved God enough to trust the wrong person. That's not the ending I wanted, but it's the truth, and truth is all we can really give the dead." Father Michael Brennan left the priesthood in 2012, citing his inability to serve an institution that had covered up child murder for 7 decades. He now works as a historical preservation consultant and has written extensively about the ethical obligations of those who uncover uncomfortable truths. His book, Behind False Walls, A Priest's Journey from Faith to Truth, became a bestseller and donated all proceeds to organizations supporting institutional abuse survivors. Detective Sarah Martinez, who led the forensic investigation, established the St. Mercy Foundation, which provides resources for cold case investigations involving missing children. The foundation has reopened more than 40 cases across the United States, resulting in dozens of convictions and bringing closure to families who had given up hope. The case's impact on the Catholic Church proved more lasting than many critics expected. The mandatory transparency policies implemented after St. Mercy Abbey have uncovered hundreds of previously concealed cases of abuse and misconduct. While the Church continues to face criticism for its historical failures, the systematic changes represent the most significant reform in institutional accountability since the Reformation. Perhaps most importantly, the St. Mercy Abbey case changed how American society views institutional authority and the protection of vulnerable populations. The phrase "sealed room" has entered common usage as a metaphor for hidden institutional crimes, while St. Mercy has become synonymous with the courage required to speak truth regardless of personal cost. Educational curricula now include the case as a study in critical thinking and institutional accountability. Children across Pennsylvania learn about Timothy O'Brien, Mary Elizabeth Chen, Anna and Peter Kowalski, James Patterson, Sarah Williams, Bobby Martinez, Rachel and David Goldman, not as victims of an inexplicable disappearance, but as young people whose voices ultimately triumphed over those who sought to silence them forever. The sealed room itself, carefully preserved and displayed in the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of American History, serves as tangible evidence that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing when someone cares enough to look. Visitors often leave flowers and handwritten notes for the children, creating an ongoing dialogue between past and present that transcends the boundaries of death. As we close this chapter in American true crime history, we're reminded that every cold case represents real people whose lives mattered, whose stories deserve to be told, and whose deaths demand accountability from the living. The children of St. Mercy Abbey waited 70 years for justice, but their patience was rewarded by a world that finally chose to listen. In the end, Father Thomas Whitmore succeeded in silencing 9 children for 7 decades, but he failed in his ultimate goal, erasing them from memory. Instead, Timothy, Mary Elizabeth, Anna, Peter, James, Sarah, Bobby, Rachel, and David have achieved a kind of immortality through their story's power to prevent future tragedies and protect future children. Their voices, scratched into stone walls and carved into wooden floors, continue to echo through time with a simple message that every generation must learn anew. The most vulnerable among us deserve protection, and the most powerful among us must be held accountable when they fail in that sacred duty. The sealed room at St. Mercy Abbey is empty now, but the children's voices will never be silenced again. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of the St. Mercy children. We'll see you in the next video. 10 years have passed since Father Michael Brennan first broke through that false wall, and the reverberations of that December morning continue to shape lives across America. What began as a simple building assessment has evolved into something far more profound, a testament to the enduring power of truth and the resilience of human memory. The St. Mercy Memorial Garden has become more than a monument. It has transformed into a living classroom where thousands of visitors annually learn about institutional accountability and the protection of vulnerable children. The 9 oak trees, now mature enough to provide shade for contemplation, stand as silent sentinels over a place where silence once enabled unspeakable horror. Each tree bears a bronze plaque with a child's photograph, images painstakingly recreated from descriptions provided by Eleanor Santos and other survivors before their deaths. Margaret O'Brien's final wish was fulfilled in a way she could never have imagined. Her brother Timothy's name now appears in history textbooks, alongside other young victims whose deaths sparked social change. The Timothy O'Brien Child Protection Act, passed by Congress in 2016, requires federal oversight of all institutions caring for vulnerable minors and mandates immediate investigation of any suspicious disappearances. Margaret's nursing home room, preserved exactly as she left it, displays a letter from the President thanking her for her decades of advocacy and acknowledging that Timothy's voice, speaking through his sister, had made America's children safer. Father Michael Brennan's post-priesthood life has been dedicated to what he calls archaeological truth-telling. His consulting firm, Brennan Historical Investigations, has uncovered evidence of institutional cover-ups in 17 different cases across 4 countries. Each investigation follows the same methodical approach he developed at St. Mercy Abbey: careful documentation, respect for victims, and unwavering commitment to transparency, regardless of institutional pressure. His memoir, now in its 3rd printing, includes a chapter titled The Weight of Discovery that has become required reading in seminary schools worldwide. Detective Sarah Martinez retired from the Pennsylvania State Police in 2019, but continues her work through the St. Mercy Foundation. The Foundation's Sealed Room project has developed sophisticated ground-penetrating radar techniques specifically designed to detect hidden chambers in institutional buildings. To date, they have identified 37 concealed spaces in schools, orphanages, and religious facilities across North America, leading to the discovery of evidence in 12 additional cold cases. Martinez often speaks at law enforcement conferences, emphasizing that every missing child deserves the same dedication, We would give a case discovered yesterday, regardless of how much time has passed. The Catholic Church's transformation, while incomplete, has been more substantial than many observers anticipated. Cardinal Francis Sullivan, convicted in 2015 at age 96, spent his final years in federal custody, becoming a symbol of institutional accountability, regardless of age or status. His conviction sent shockwaves through religious hierarchies worldwide, leading to policy reforms in multiple denominations. Pope Francis established the Saint Mercy Commission in 2018, an independent body with authority to investigate institutional cover-ups and recommend disciplinary action. The Commission's first report, released in 2020, acknowledged 847 cases of confirmed concealment involving child welfare issues across 6 decades. The Millbrook community itself has been forever changed by the revelation that their quiet town had harbored one of America's most shocking crimes for 70 years. The local historical society, once focused on preserving pleasant memories of small-town life, now dedicates significant resources to education about institutional abuse and the importance of community vigilance. Millbrook High School's social studies curriculum includes a mandatory unit called the Saint Mercy Lessons, which teaches students to question authority, report suspicious behavior, and understand their role as protectors of those who cannot protect themselves. Dr. Amanda Chen, the prosecutor who led the investigation and discovered her family connection to victim Mary Elizabeth Chen, has become a leading advocate for victims' rights in cold cases. Her legal clinic at the University of Pennsylvania provides pro bono services to families seeking to reopen investigations involving missing children. Dr. Chen's research has identified what she terms institutional memory gaps, patterns of missing records and transferred personnel that often indicate deliberate concealment. Her work has influenced legislation in 14 states requiring preservation of child welfare records for a minimum of 100 years. The physical evidence from the sealed room continues to yield new insights as forensic technology advances. In 2021, enhanced DNA analysis of fabric fragments found in the room revealed trace evidence that provided additional confirmation of the children's identities and final days. More significantly, chemical analysis of wall scratches has allowed forensic linguists to determine the chronological order of many messages, creating a timeline of the children's psychological state during their imprisonment. This research, while heartbreaking, has provided valuable insights for understanding trauma responses in similar situations. The case's impact on true crime media has been profound and largely positive. The St. Mercy Abbey story has been featured in 17 documentaries, 4 books, and countless podcast episodes, but coverage has been notably respectful of the victims and focused on systemic issues rather than sensationalism. The St. Mercy Foundation maintains editorial oversight of any commercial media about the case, ensuring that profits support child protection initiatives and that portrayals emphasize the children's humanity rather than exploiting their suffering. Perhaps most remarkably, the discovery has inspired a new generation of what investigators call historical advocates, individuals who dedicate themselves to researching old cases involving vulnerable populations. Amateur historians, genealogists, and retired professionals have formed networks dedicated to identifying patterns of suspicious disappearances and institutional cover-ups. Their work has contributed to the reopening of more than 200 cold cases involving missing children, elder abuse, and institutional neglect. The sealed room itself, now displayed at the Smithsonian, receives more than 100,000 visitors annually. The exhibit, titled Voices in the Stone, When Institutions Fail, presents the children's story within the broader context of institutional accountability and social responsibility. Visitors often spend hours reading the wall messages, photographed and translated into multiple languages. The most common visitor comment recorded in the museum's guest book is a simple promise: "We won't let this happen again." Educational impact has extended internationally, with the St. Mercy Abbey case study included in child protection curricula across Europe, Australia, and Canada. The phrase "sealed room syndrome" has entered academic vocabulary to describe situations where institutional secrecy enables ongoing harm to vulnerable populations. University programs in social work, criminal justice, and theology now require coursework examining how the St. Mercy cover-up succeeded for 7 decades and what systemic changes prevent similar concealment. The memorial garden itself has evolved into an unexpected center for healing and education. The original 9 trees have been joined by hundreds of smaller plantings, each representing a child whose disappearance was subsequently solved through investigations inspired by the St. Mercy case. Families travel from across the continent to add their children's names to the memorial wall, creating a growing testament to persistence and hope. The garden's guest book contains thousands of entries from visitors sharing their own stories of loss, institutional betrayal, and the courage required to seek truth. On every December 15th, the anniversary of the children's imprisonment, a simple ceremony is held at the memorial garden. No speeches are given, no formal programs conducted. Instead, 9 candles are lit at sunset while volunteers read the names of all children whose cases remain unsolved. The ceremony concludes with a moment of silence, followed by the reading of James Patterson's final message, "Tell them, we were good children." Father Whitmore's grave in California has become an unexpected site of pilgrimage, though not the kind he might have expected. Visitors leave letters addressed to the 9 children, asking forgiveness for the adult world that failed to protect them. Some leave toys and school supplies, symbols of the childhood that was stolen from Timothy, Mary Elizabeth, Anna, Peter, James, Sarah, Bobby, Rachel, and David. The monastery maintains these tributes, viewing them as an important part of the healing process for a society grappling with institutional failure. The case has also prompted significant changes in how missing persons investigations are conducted. The St. Mercy Protocol requires investigators to examine all institutional records, interview transferred personnel regardless of location, and use advanced technology to search for hidden spaces in buildings. This protocol has been credited with solving 43 cold cases in its first 5 years of implementation. As we reflect on the decades since the discovery, it's clear that the 9 children of St. Mercy Abbey achieved something in death that was denied to them in life. Their voices became powerful enough to change the world. Their suffering was not meaningless. It became a catalyst for protecting countless other children who might otherwise have vanished into institutional silence. The sealed room that once held 9 dying children now holds their immortal legacy, a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, possesses an inexorable power to surface when compassionate people refuse to accept official silence as the final word. Timothy O'Brien wanted to be a train conductor, carrying people safely to their destinations. Mary Elizabeth Chen dreamed of becoming a teacher, nurturing young minds. Anna Kowalski hoped to become a nurse, healing the sick and injured. Peter wanted to write stories that would make people laugh. James Patterson planned to become a police officer, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Sarah Williams dreamed of reunion with her mother and a house filled with flowers from her garden. Bobby Martinez simply wanted his mother to come home. Rachel and David Goldman dreamed of America as a place where they could grow up free from fear. They never lived to fulfill these dreams, but their deaths have made it possible for millions of other children to pursue their own hopes with greater safety and protection. In the end, the children of St. Mercy Abbey became exactly what they dreamed of becoming: protectors, teachers, healers, and guardians of truth. Their voices, once silenced by stone walls and institutional power, now echo across time and space, ensuring that no child will ever again disappear into deliberate silence. The sealed room is empty now, but the children's presence fills the world with the enduring power of truth finally spoken and justice finally served. In death, they found the voice that life had denied them. In memory, they achieved the safety that their brief lives had been denied. In legacy, they became the protectors they needed but never had. The 9 children of St. Mercy Abbey are finally, eternally home.